It sounded almost like a familiar story in media. A TV station with a big news website starts in the mid-2000s. The station never attracts as many viewers as it's supposed to, and the funding gets cut off. The station goes out of business, and most of the staff lose their jobs. Except this case was different, because the TV station is Russia Today, or RT America. Its funding came from the Russian government, and it shut down in the first week of March amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
The station's management described the closure as a result of unforeseen business interruption events.
Cable providers had cut ties with RT, and in Europe, YouTube, TikTok, and Meta all blocked RT content.
RT had been a platform for speakers and views from the right, and perhaps especially the left, that are rarely heard on mainstream American TV news. It was Larry King's last professional home, and the comedian Dennis Miller's as well. As an American TV news outlet, it was unusual. As a foreign propaganda effort, it was more conventional.
If we think of misinformation as being subtle, RT was the opposite.
This week on the show, we're talking about Russia's experiment with American news.
What was it meant to accomplish? How did Russia change over RT's lifespan?
And what comes next? I'm Alex Pareene.
And I'm Laura Marsh.
This is The Politics of Everything.
This episode is brought to you by Simple Mobile. Tired of being tied down with a wireless contract? Switch to Simple Mobile and stay connected on a powerful nationwide 5G network. Unlimited talk, text, and data starts at $30 a month with no contracts, activation fees, or credit checks. Visit simplemobile.com today. Out with the old, in with the simple. Compatible 5G capable device and SIM required. Actual availability, coverage, and speed may vary. 5G network not available in all areas. 1 month equals 30 days. See terms and conditions at simplemobile.com.
Peter Pomerantsev is a journalist who spent several years living and working in Moscow. He's the author of 2 books on Russian disinformation and propaganda, and we thought he could explain to us what RT was all about. Hi, Peter. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
We're talking about Russia Today. RT was launched in 2005. What was its stated mission, and why was it created?
RT was initially created with the mission of being Russia's kind of public diplomacy state information channel, a bit like Deutsche Welle, which is the German one, which is tied to the state, but pretty independent, or I guess maybe a little bit like Voice of America or something. So officially, Russia felt that it needed its own voice internationally. And a lot of the content right at the start was really quite anodyne. Just, here's a trouble show about Russia. And, here's the world news, but we interview a Russian official about it. It's not an American one. Perfectly legitimate bit of statecraft that most big countries do.
Right. Like you mentioned Voice of America. And it's not out of the ordinary for a country to have a sort of state media broadcasting internationally.
Yeah, Deutsche Welle would be a better comparison because Voice of America is housed outside of government and inside something called USAGM, which has institutional barriers between itself and the state. So Deutsche Welle, which is the German one, or I think France 24 as well, is literally, the culture ministry at its TV channel. And it's sort of funded directly, not through Congress and various other things.
If you took the stories that were broadcast on Russia Today at face value, what kind of image did it project of Russia?
So as I said, at the start, it was all about countering this image of Russia as a country of drunks and potholes and prisons and saying, well, there's a bit more to it than that. Look, that's perfectly legitimate. It was meant to be news about Russia. But then from kind of 2008, it pivoted very hard and it became something completely different, kind of with the invasion of Georgia. And it becomes very much a tool of Russian political warfare. And it stopped being news about Russia because no one's really interested in Russia. It was a way of basically tapping into various narratives of discontent in Western societies, not just Western, also Middle Eastern, also Latin American, shaping them in line with the priorities of Russian foreign policy. So, for example, in Germany, they targeted the anti-vaxxers. So they would do lots and lots of conspiracies about vaccines, sort of get in with that group in society, and then feed them disinformation about Syria and Ukraine.
Yeah, and it was around that time that shift you identify that they launched RT America here in the States. And what was interesting is that, as you say, there was very little content about Russia on RT America. And for the most part, they had a lot of voices on that you would identify with the American political left, often discussing a lot of domestic issues. What benefit did that have to Russian foreign policy? Why would that be a messaging strategy that you think they would have pursued in the United States?
So in the United States, the Russians generally have been cultivating the far right, business elites, and the far left. So, I mean, you just basically sort of look at whichever elements of society are important and open to your messaging. You know, the far left criticizes American imperialism, and that's very useful for Russia. So it's not a hard sell. Whether they have any meaning in American politics, I don't know. I think the far right, the Bannon far right, and now the Tucker Carlson far right are much more meaningful.
How do you see Russia today as fitting into a broader Russian propaganda strategy? Because obviously this is just one outlet, and it's a pretty traditional way of doing propaganda, you know, like having a TV station.
So I don't think as a TV station it was effective in Europe or America. I think in the sense where it was effective was online. That means, for example, targeting content in very, very specific ways to very specific audiences, but also more than that, being part of this whole network of fake online accounts, websites that look genuine but aren't, and putting themselves in that network, which first obviously helps with diffusion of their messaging, but maybe more important, starts to game the Google algorithm with certain stories. So the digital operation was meant to be much more sort of effective than the broadcast one, where their figures were always, I think, not very impressive.
Right. Well, one of the reasons that we were interested in doing an episode on this is that you can look at Russia today in a serious way and say, you know, this was a project of the Russian government. But it's also really hard to look at RT and take it seriously, because I don't think it was ever taken seriously by a large number of people. And it's kind of ridiculous, right? Because it's so openly biased.
Like the rest of American TV.
Well, we can definitely have that conversation.
Well, I think that's what I found interesting about it, though, because I think it's a projection of the Russian government's really firm belief in the complete hypocrisy of the West, right? In that your television stations are just propaganda, so it shouldn't really matter if ours is unconvincing propaganda almost. Do you think there's anything to that?
Well, I mean, that's generally a line they use all the time. I mean, if you want to go really complicated and into it, sort of the Russian doctrine of information warfare basically says that democratic communication is impossible. Basically, their claim is that all types of communication are actually manipulation. You know, whether it's human rights NGOs, basically, you know, the public sphere and the liberal democratic idea of it don't exist. They're a myth. And all things like freedom of speech is just a weapon invented by the West to get at Russia. And basically all information is a form of warfare. But in terms of it being a joke, I mean, look, the aim of any sort of, you know, information operation or whatever of this sort is to get your stuff picked up by locals and amplified. And in that sense, I mean, RT, whatever, but the whole Russian stuff in America has been, to my mind, surprisingly effective. So obviously back to 16, you have this stunning moment where they hack the DNC, leak it through Assange, and then the story is amplified by mainstream TV channels in America. That's success. That's how they go, wow, information op worked. And look, we don't care about RT and its future very much. You have the largest political talk show host in America repeating Kremlin talking points and disinformation night after night after night on American TV. Obviously, on Russian TV, Tucker Carlson is now a star. He's shown back on Russian TV. I mean, that is remarkable. So, you know, it's easy to laugh at some of the Russian efforts, but the fact that, I mean, they have somebody who's just essentially their, I don't want to use the word puppet, or even useful idiot, but someone who's, you know, a transmitter for them essentially now, is a remarkable victory for them.
I'd love for you to just explain for us why Russia so effectively works with both far right and far left, because I think people might assume that when a country engages in propaganda, they're trying to push a specific line so that they would be trying to support a right-wing agenda or a left-wing agenda. But that's not what Russia's doing, is it? The broader aim is not to get people to agree that one set of policies is preferable. It's kind of just to create discord.
No, there are multiple aims. I mean, you're quite right. This general idea is that to keep the enemy from your gates, you keep them busy at home. But look, that's a pretty grand aim, and you can't really do that unless people are pretty divided already. But usually it's much more specific than that. You embed yourself in various communities and then spread the disinformation lines you want. You know, Ukrainians are all neo-Nazis or something, or, you know, the war in Syria is justified. So that would be a much more tactical aim. Yes, you're right. The grand aim is to keep everyone divided and fighting in amongst themselves. And by the way, that's something they did in the Cold War a lot. They would support both sort of civil rights movement in their own way, in their very kind of very weird way, and the Ku Klux Klan. They'd try to get them to fight with each other even more.
So one of the things we're talking about is the change in Russian media and also the presence of Russian media in the US and of American media in Russia. One of the intriguing things is that Russia Today in America just closed down. And that might seem like no great loss because it wasn't exactly, a reputable news source. And like we're saying, like it was seeding Russian talking points that were then being picked up in American media. But what do you see as the next phase? Like, is there a sense in which an international environment in which an outlet like RT can't operate in a country like the US is even worse than one in which it can?
Look, censorship is always the last step. Democracies are always going to be open to foreign influence operation, and they should be. Democracies are messy, they're open, and the Russians will find another workaround. It's not a huge challenge. All these assets are completely expendable. So that's, there'll be something else.
Do you think that what comes next will be harder to recognize than the more crude attempts that Russia Today was putting out?
Those are really good questions. And I suppose the simple answer is we don't know necessarily. Humor will be more in the online space than in the broadcast space. However, look, if you've got Tucker Carlson transmitting your ideas, then that's what you're going to focus it on. So we'll see. I'm not massively alarmed by kind of a Russian info op. I'm much more alarmed by clearly a segment of the Republican Party and clearly a segment of their donors who fundamentally look up to Putin, fundamentally agree with him, and fundamentally will continue that relationship and push his agenda. That's a political choice being made. That's not an info op. There's a reason Tucker Carlson's doing this. I don't know the details of that reason, but clearly he thinks there is an influential audience that wants to hear this and influential backers who will back him.
I mean, it's an interesting question because I do think that part of it is just like a sort of right-wing affection for a strong man can be enough to push Tucker to do something like that.
That's pretty alarming already, though. It's not just,
No, I know. It's incredibly alarming. I agree.
It's like war crimes. Yay. That says something very dark about, the American political landscape.
Peter, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Arrivederci. Speak to you soon.
Peter Pomerantsev is the author, most recently, of This Is Not Propaganda: Adventures in the War Against Reality.
After the break, we'll talk about how Russia has changed since RT was founded.
This episode is supported by Cambridge University Press. Net zero emissions is only the beginning. Even after we stop emitting carbon dioxide, temperatures will remain elevated. Climate dangers will continue to accrue, and sea levels will rise for centuries. In Pandora's Toolbox, The Hopes and Hazards of Climate Intervention, Wake Smith offers a rigorous, passionate, and accessible introduction to some of humanity's most controversial technologies, like carbon removal and solar radiation management, which may be key to the global response to the climate crisis. Pandora's Toolbox by Wake Smith is available through all book retailers.
Right now, the Supreme Court is hearing major cases on abortion rights. If Roe v. Wade falls, what next? On a special episode of the New Yorker Radio Hour, Gia Tolentino joins me to look at what's happening in Texas, Mississippi, and across the border in Mexico. And our expert on constitutional law explains some decisions that weaken the foundation of abortion rights from the very start. That's the New Yorker Radio Hour, wherever you listen to podcasts.
I'd love to tell you about the podcast Intelligence Squared US. Since 2006, Intelligence Squared US has addressed a fundamental problem in America: the extreme polarization of our nation and our politics. You can hear today's top thinkers debate the most important issues of the day in an unbiased civil forum, grounded in civility and respect, tackling topics that range from technology to law to international relations with China. Intelligence Squared US is a smart and engaging podcast that helps challenge your perspective and calls for a return to balanced civil discourse in the public square. Download it now and think twice about where you stand.
Up until just a few weeks ago, Western journalists could live and work in Russia with freedom that would have been unthinkable to those who remember the Cold War. We had our media there. Russians had, for better or worse, their media here. We're talking to Ben Judah about the Russia of a few weeks and a few years ago. He's had a long relationship with the country. After studying Russian in school, he first traveled there in 2004. Eventually, he based himself out of Moscow and worked there for a time as a freelance journalist. Ben, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So you recently wrote an article titled The Russia We Have Lost, in part about being a 20-something expat in Moscow in the 2000s and the sense of hope and possibility that you and others felt then. And I know some other people who were like you in the former Soviet Union in those times when it felt like a sort of brighter future was possible. Can you bring us back to what that moment felt like long before this invasion of Ukraine?
Even though Putin, by that point, had been in power for really quite some time, there was still a lot of optimism about Russia's future from Moscow elites, Russian society, Western diplomats, Westerners in Moscow. It was really a very exciting and positive place to be. It was a very dynamic European city. And, looking back to it, it was a moment where you could very easily come and find work or be a sort of foreign correspondent or even just sort of pretend to be a foreign correspondent on some kind of dodgy visa fixed in Kiev and sort of float around in a world of Russian liberals and dissidents and people sort of from even more sort of liberal elements of the regime that were more prominent and considered themselves more empowered at the time.
And were there reasons to think that that would change?
Even though there were fears about Russia's future, you did meet people who were very worried about Russia sinking back into Soviet-style oppression. That wasn't the dominant opinion. The dominant opinion was that Putin was a kleptocrat, that he was more interested in money, he was more interested in the good life, in spending time in France. He would always put his own business circle's interests first. And if there was going to be kind of oppression and games with the West, it would be of a sort of first as tragedy, then as farce kind of variant. There would never be anything like what we're seeing now. And it sort of pains me to say that even though I have a pretty grotesque and pornographic imagination, nothing as pornographic and grotesque as what Vladimir Putin is doing to Ukraine right now or to Russian society right now was even considered like remotely possible.
So to stay in that moment of optimism, what kind of future did people envision at that time?
Well, I'm like a pessimist by nature, and people's political sense of the future at the time could probably be best predicted off their kind of personality types. But the consensus was that Russia's future would be a sort of darker version of where Turkey is now. That there would be a strongman who would have an antagonistic relationship with the West. He wouldn't break with it. He would allow there to be pockets of dissent and freedom, but he would have to make sure that he still was popular with the people, that he still gave them what they wanted, that he still kind of negotiated with the sort of billionaires and the elites in that country. And like that was the consensus at that moment, sort of in the mid-2000s.
I want to get at what I think is a really remarkable change. It was possible to be an independent journalist. It was possible to have an amount of press freedom then. You could go around reporting things that might have been uncomfortable for the government, right?
So let's look at it like this. Actually, quite helpful to look at the political science to help us kind of guide conceptually what we're talking about, which is, even though for Americans, Putin has been a dictator in the public discourse for a very long time, the actual regime type that he ruled for most of his early regime, it's been going on for almost 23 years now. It's important to remember that this thing has evolved, is what political scientists will call a hybrid regime. And that means that there is an authoritarian mainframe. You can't really challenge him. Elections are rigged in whole or in part. All of the key institutions of the state are sewn up and he can't be toppled. But within that, there will be pockets of freedom and free speech and even certain low-level political positions that the opposition can hold. And a good kind of way to track this is the career of the Russian opposition sort of main leader, Alexei Navalny. Like at that time, you could just meet him. You could just go and have a drink with him. He was just blogging furiously and sort of raging into the internet. Anyone who would listen, ignored largely by most of Russia and by Russian authorities. And as that period comes to an end, like after the Georgian War, after the financial crisis, it's important to track what happens to him. And you see in 2011, when he was one of the main figures in a protest movement that really shook the Putin regime, he was gathering Russian opposition activists in kind of bars or cafes, all of the excitement of a sort of almost revolutionary moment. He was tweeting the hell out of things. He had his own website, his own YouTube channel. And then a couple of years later, his website's blocked. Then he's put under house arrest. Then he's almost murdered. Now he's jailed, and the news today is he's being sent to a prison colony with a stricter regime at the demand of the Russian state prosecutor. So the story of Navalny is really the story of a changing Moscow in terms of how it felt to be there for Russian liberals or for people in the privileged position that I was as a Western expat and sort of largely useless journalist, or in the story of the Russian regime itself, from hybrid to what political scientists would call a fully authoritarian regime.
So there's a turn toward much more severe repression then, but do you think what's happened in the last couple of weeks marks a distinct new phase in Russia?
What's happened over the last few weeks is Russia has really crossed the line, I think, into a more sort of chaotic and frightening position where it's really going towards a form of totalitarianism. And I know that's a very unfashionable word, but I do think it's the right word to use for a couple of reasons. The first is I only think Russia's crossing into that. I don't think it's fully there yet, but I think it's crossing for the following reasons. The first is a new law has been passed on fake news, which ends any pretense of Russians being able to come to their own conclusions and share them online or in the print media. That contradicts the thoughts of the Kremlin. And that's a law that says that you're punishable with up to 15 years in jail by disseminating fake news about the special operation that Putin claims is underway in Ukraine, which he doesn't call a war. And even calling it a war can result in that sentence. That has been accompanied with the mass blocking of foreign news websites that have a large Russian language offering, such as BBC Russian or Deutsche Welle or Radio Svoboda. It's been met with the end of the last liberal radio station, Echo Moskvy, the last liberal TV station, Rain TV or Dozhd in Russian, and a amp up of the pressure put on public figures. Public figures who've spoken against the war have disappeared from public view, and the scale of arrests is now really not something we've seen at this scale before, like over 13,000 people.
You're saying it's more than just the treatment of the press.
This has been accompanied by two kind of hallmarks of the beginnings of totalitarianism, which are the politics of mobilization. You know, this Z campaign, and Z is the letter that they're drawing on military equipment in Ukraine in order to be able to differentiate them from Ukrainian military equipment, a lot of which is the same military equipment because it's Soviet. And there's been this sort of mass campaign across Russia of people putting Z on their car, children sort of singing songs to the sort of the supreme leader with little Z, cute little Zs on them. And then a sort of militarization of the regime's aesthetic, sense of purpose, and the beginnings of a militarization of society. So I think it's important that to talk about totalitarianism and Russia, and also our perception of it, is a lot of people alive today in Russia and the West remember what it's like when totalitarianism ends. Nobody really, I hate to say it, outside of a few sort of nursing homes, remembers what it's like when totalitarianism begins.
That's a really good point. To go back to that, you need to read Arthur Koestler or someone. It's not something anyone alive can tell you about. One of the consequences of the invasion has been not just that Western media has been blocked in Russia, but that Western news organizations have largely withdrawn from Russia. They're not operating there anymore. What do you see, or what do you anticipate as the effect of that? Or what are we going to lose by not having news organizations there?
Well, I just think it's a catastrophic situation. I don't think I can underscore that or bold it enough. Even during some of the worst moments of Stalinism, there was a New York Times bureau present in Moscow. They've now had to withdraw because criminal law applies to everybody, of course, and their journalists could be jailed for 15 years in Russia for describing what's happening as a war. We've already seen that final destruction of Russian journalism means that the Russian elite and us, who kind of depend on them as sources or analysts of their own society to draw our analysis of Russia, just know a lot less about it. You couple that with the end of functioning Western journalism on Russian soil, we're going to be in a situation where we just know a lot less about what's happening in Russia and definitely about what's happening in the Kremlin.
So this is a more counterintuitive way of asking a similar question, but one of the reasons we started to do this episode was that RT in America closed down. And RT is not a respected, reliable news outlet here. But do you think that we're losing something simply by not being able to access Russian media in the US?
Obviously, Russia Today is a ridiculous and sort of filthy channel. But the main priority, I felt, definitely for the UK, was not to get BBC Russian blocked. And if that meant letting this sort of ridiculous thing stream away, I was happy to have it, as long as BBC Russian, with its huge million-strong audience, was left there. And I just don't think that enough people are thinking strategically about a lot of this right now. Like, if you're dealing with a regime crossing into totalitarianism that's been half blockaded from the world, half closing itself off from the world, engaging in a war of conquest with delirious mobilization campaigns, you've got to just think very carefully about all of these different things that are being done and what will the second order consequences be for what could be a very long confrontation.
Yeah, it strikes me that what you described here is, and I think Americans in particular, Americans who don't pay attention to Russia, Americans who don't make an effort to learn about Russia, could get the sort of caricatured view that Putin's Russia has been this authoritarian state the whole time. And while it was a managed democracy with a thug at the head of it, with fake elections, for a long time, as you described, he was allowing this liberal society to continue to exist, this liberal society to continue to produce journalism, foreign reporters to continue having freedom of movement in Russia for the most part. And that is what has been lost now. It's a huge change. I do think it's important for Americans to understand that a Rubicon has been crossed, basically, and especially in the sense of the accurate information we will be able to get about life on the ground in Russia.
I really agree with you that a Rubicon's been passed in Russia in terms of oppression. I think we have to change how we look at Russia and how we talk about Russia, especially when it comes to policymakers. So I have seen the former ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, tweeting feverishly, and by that I really mean feverishly, that Russians should be running into the streets and sort of mass protesting and quitting their jobs and speaking up now. And I really want him to realise, and I've told him, this is not the Russia of 2012 or 2011, when you could do that as a professor, as a public figure, as a journalist, and then go back to work the next day and not fear devastating consequences. We are in a situation now where you could be risking 15 years in prison. Are you sure that that's what you want to be asking for? And in terms of this sort of lurid speculation about palace coups and coming collapse of Russia and people with firmer prognostication than Nostradamus about what the second order consequences of this war are going to be, I really want them to just stop, take a deep breath, possibly turn the app off for 48 hours and go, the majority of the expert class in the United States did not see this war coming. And that's because Russia's elite, Russian journalism, and the remains of that and Western journalism were not able, even when they were in Russia, to predict this was happening next. So I think we need to take a bit of intellectual humility here and recognise that Putin's mind, how the Kremlin operates, is a lot more of a black box than we realised, and not just swap one set of assumptions for another overnight.
Yeah, I mean, it does strike me that, and I say this as someone who, I'm not a foreign policy expert, but just reading everything I read about this before the invasion, I was like, I don't know, it seems like the war, it might not happen. And I turned out to be wrong. I didn't make that prediction publicly, but it does seem like intellectual humility is the correct answer for this.
I'm actually really quite worried about the information environment I'm seeing in US political discussion and managing what's going to be a long confrontation with Russia. Because Twitter is incentivizing pundits to shout the loudest, to get the most likes, to get the most clicks in order to be heard. And I think that would have been really dangerous in the worst moments of the Cold War.
Imagine Cuban Missile Crisis Twitter. My God. We'd be dead.
Exactly. And Twitter's also bringing like a lot of conspiracy theories from Ukraine into the Washington mix and are being disseminated and talked about by people who should really know better. And it's also giving us like a false impression of the battlefield, quite frankly, which is, Twitter's not a neutral environment. It is under absolute Ukrainian dominance in terms of the information war. Western governments are actively trying to promote an image of Ukraine standing firm and victorious. Like, look at the UK government or the French government's daily battle maps. Like, I'm sorry, those are not like neutral battle maps being drawn up. And then all of these open source intelligence guys from their bedrooms or their offices drawing up analysis of what the videos that are posted there, when we know for a fact that the Russians have been very bad about the fact that Ukrainians are filming them. The Ukrainians have been very good about not filming themselves. We're not seeing any videos of Ukrainian defeats or columns being blown up. And a lot of people are drawing analysis of all of this very, very partial world, thinking it's impartial. And I think that's quite a risky situation to be in. I think you can come to a lot of very false conclusions about what's going on.
Ben Judah, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you very much. That was great.
Ben Judah's article, The Russia We Have Lost, was published at Unheard. He's the author of Fragile Empire, How Russia Fell In and Out of Love with Vladimir Putin. The Politics of Everything is co-produced by Talkhouse.
Emily Cook is our executive producer.
Myron Kaplan is our audio editor.
If you enjoy the show and you want to help support it, one thing you can do is rate and review it wherever you get your podcasts. Every review helps.
Thanks for listening.
To follow more political and social commentary by some of the country's most acclaimed independent journalists, subscribe to The New Republic with our special offer. Get 3 months of unlimited digital access for $5. You can take advantage of the deal at tnr.com/special offer.